Welcome everybody to the March Tech Site meeting between Dallas and Fort Worth sections. Thanks everybody for showing up today. We got a couple of quick announcements that we need to make to y'all while we have everybody everybody here. First off, our next meeting will be on April 15th. It's going to be from our folks from the city of Fort Worth, Julia Ryan, and it'll be regarding our policy to action making the case for complete streets. Our next couple of meetings after that, we're still in discussions between both sections and the state. The spring meeting has been canceled. The state board are looking to work in some of those sessions into some of our meetings. So there is a good chance that a couple of our meetings in the summer will be 2 hours instead of our normal 1 hour, where these presentations could be made to the entire state. So be on the lookout for that, and we'll make sure that we keep you informed. Tell you all about some of our future events. We're going to be working with our younger members committee to try to have a virtual social meeting sometimes this spring. We're still working out the details on that. We're probably looking sometime in the May timeframe, so we'll get you some more information on that. We're still shooting for the golf tournament this fall, sometime in either September or October. And we are also still working on getting the joint meeting. We're probably looking at an August timeframe for that joint meeting. So hopefully we'll be at a very good place by that point. We're still shooting for the Tech Site ITS Texas joint meeting here in Dallas sometime in early to mid-November. So while we will continue to do these virtual meetings for probably the first half of 2021, we are planning to hopefully have some times where we can actually get back together and actually see each other. Quick show of our bank accounts. Our scholarship hasn't changed, obviously, and our general account has gone up. Thank you, ITE fees. And with that, I will throw it over to Chad to introduce our speaker for this meeting.
Thank you, Joe. So Dr. Wes Kumfer joined the University of North Carolina's Highway Safety Research Center in 2017 as a postdoctoral research associate with a focus on crash analysis and safety education. His primary research interest is traffic safety management through a system-oriented approach. While at HSRC, Dr. Kumfer has worked on pedestrian crash modeling, safe systems implementation, and engineering evaluation. He uses this experience as a member of the Road to Zero Safe System and Traffic Safety Culture working groups. Prior to joining HSRC, Dr. Kumfer worked as a postdoctoral research associate and course instructor at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, as part of the Texas Tech University Center for Multidisciplinary Research in Transportation. Wes received his doctorate in civil engineering at TTU and was active in TTU's Teaching, Learning, and Professional Development Center as a fellow, consultant, and workshop facilitator. In his free time, Wes enjoys hiking with his wife and his dog. So I will pass it over to my friend, Wes Kumfer.
Thank you so much, Chad. Appreciate it. So, word is opening for some reason. I hope that you won't hear my dog today, but she might bark. It really depends on whether or not a delivery truck comes by. So she might make an appearance. But thank you again, Chad, for the invitation, and happy to be here talking, especially happy to see some of my TTU friends who are here. I don't encounter many TTU alum in North Carolina, so it's nice to be talking to a crowd with some familiar faces. So today I'm going to be covering identifying pedestrian safety risks through systemic crash analysis. This is a project that I worked on when I first started at HSRC, and that some of my subsequent research has really built on. And I'm going to try today to integrate this research project with a few lessons from some others and kind of use that as a backbone for a case I'm going to make. So today I'm going to attempt to answer some questions, being why do we need a systemic safety approach? How do we measure safety? How is a systemic safety approach different than what we usually do? What countermeasures can we use? And how have state DOTs used systemic safety approaches? But before I get started answering those questions, I want to know just a little bit more about the crowd. So Chad, can you launch poll 1? So tell me if you are in public or private practice.
So while we're doing this poll, I want to remind everybody, if you have questions as we're going through this webinar, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will make time for those at the end of the meeting. So it looks like we've got everybody in here.
Great.
It's about 50-50.
Okay, so 50-50 public and privates. Awesome. My second question is, do you consider yourself a planner, an engineer, or something else? I work with a lot of planners, and I know that more and more planners are joining ITE, so just curious what kind of organization I'm working with here, or talking to today.
So it
Most
looks like we have about 90% almost are engineers with a few planners.
That sounds good. Okay, so next question. Do you measure transportation safety as part of your job? I sure hope everyone says yes, but, you know, be honest. All right, so about 90% yes, 9% no. That sounds reasonable. I think probably most of us as engineers consider ourselves, at least in some way, responsible for ensuring the public safety. So that's good to see that that was that high. And then my last question, and this is an open-ended one that I think I'm going to try to address today, is what methods, if you do measure safety, are you using?
And we don't have a poll for this, so if you want to just type it into the chat to all panelists and attendees so we can all see.
And I am looking at the chat pod. The number of accidents, okay. Rates and frequency, okay. Highway safety manual, all right. Crash data. FYI, type and severity of accidents, safety manual. All right, collision analysis, that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that one too. So really the gamut here. I see collision analysis, which I think is very important. I see highway safety manual, which I'm going to touch on today. I see crash rates. You are going to hear me use the word crash instead of accident. This is something of a public health approach to discussing the topic. I'd like to believe that most crashes are preventable. And so that's why I use the term crash instead of accidents. Accident kind of has an implication that there's nothing we could do. Oh, it just kind of happened. I like to believe that we can improve safety and we can save lives. So that's why I use that language. You'll see in a lot of the international literature, people will also say accidents. It's pretty interchangeable. So I'm not going to get hung up on that, though. All right, thank you all for answering those questions. I think you're going to see most of the methods you just talked about I'm going to bring up today. But I'm going to move on now. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be primarily discussing systemic safety analysis, and this is drawn from a project for the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, Systemic Pedestrian Safety Analysis. That one is online. If you get curious about this presentation and want to look for it, you can download it for free. But I'm also going to be drawing some lessons from a few other projects, the first being one called Implementing the Safe Systems of the United States, Guiding Principles and Lessons from International Practice. And this was done for the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety, which is a university transportation center. The third one is an FHWA project called a Safe System-Based Framework and Analytical Methodology for Assessing Intersections. I was a sub to VHB on that project, and that one should be online pretty soon, but I don't think it is yet. The fourth here is another National Cooperative Highway Research Program called Guide to Pedestrian Analysis. We recently wrapped this one up and generated some new models for pedestrian level of service that should be incorporated in a future edition of the Highway Capacity Manual. but that guide is also not out yet. And then the last one is called Shaping the Narrative Around Traffic Injury, a media framing guide for transportation and public health professionals. And this was another Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety project. Again, focusing mostly on the systemic part, but weaving in some concepts and ideas from the other ones. So that first question I asked, why do we need a systemic approach? My answer to this is going to be safety trends in the United States. From 2009 to 2018, pedestrian fatalities in the United States have increased by 53%. And if we compare that to other modes, we look at motor vehicle occupants, we look at bicyclists, we look at motorcyclists, we really only see over that same period of time an increase by 2% of all the other modes. So pedestrian fatalities are exploding in a way that other traffic fatalities are not. And they account for about 17% of all across the whole United States. And the SUV-involved pedestrian fatalities has increased by 81% during that same period of time. These were 2018 numbers. We have rough numbers from 2019, the projected being 6,590. Last I saw, that wasn't a finalized number yet, but if so, that is a 30-year high in pedestrian fatalities in the United States. This is a huge problem, and it's pretty consistent from state to state. So I pulled up some stats for Texas and saw in 2019, there were 5,975 crashes involving pedestrians, leading to 1,317 serious injuries and 669 deaths. So about a tenth of the national total pedestrian fatalities in 2019 occurred in Texas. And that was an 18% increase from 2015 to 2019. And pedestrians now account for about 20% of all traffic fatalities in Texas. I think this is a pretty serious issue, and I think that our current practices of addressing safety, of project prioritization, of the way that we prioritize modal transportation in this country is letting pedestrians down. And they far outpaced other fatalities by all other modes, and yet we consistently see that pedestrians tend to receive very little investments from Highway Safety Improvement Program funds. They're often kind of an afterthought in intersection projects when you're looking at what sort of treatments or engineering measures are installed. I just think, engineers just aren't given the same sort of priority that motor vehicles are. And this is really important to consider, especially because Texas has 4 Vision Zero cities, Vision Zero being a paradigm or goal to achieve zero death or fatality by a certain year. I think a lot of cities have like 2030 or 2035, but you're not going to get it at zero if you aren't protecting your pedestrians. And I think a big limitation in the United States is that we still tend to have a very individualistic perspective of safety. We tend to think, oh, a crash is a result of a driver error or a road user error. And this is reflected in the way that even the media talks about pedestrian crashes. We see reports like, preliminary report indicates man not in crosswalk, or this person was critically injured after being struck by a vehicle while outside of a marked crosswalk. Example after example of that. My question upon reading those kinds of headlines and seeing these statistics is, why are pedestrians not using crosswalks? And if that's the case, are we misunderstanding the way that pedestrians want to use the road and want to travel, and are we therefore not prioritizing their needs to the same degree as other modes? And that's what I'm going to try to get at today. But I'm first going to divert and talk about how it is that we measure safety. And this is why I asked that question about what measure you use in your job, because there are a lot of different methods that we can use to try to quantify safety. Probably the most common method that we use to say whether or not a facility is safe is to say if it has a lot of crashes or not a lot of crashes. And this leads to traditional transportation safety management, which focuses on addressing those hot spots or those high crash locations. I think this is a good thing to do, and we need to continue doing hotspot analysis, but I don't think it's the only part of the story. And in fact, only treating hotspots is missing kind of a broader picture. There are a lot of limitations to it. One being just that hotspot analysis is inherently reactive. You are seeing where high crashes occur, and then you are installing engineering countermeasures there. Pedestrian crashes may be rare. Even though they constitute 20% of the total fatalities in Texas, if you look at an actual city's roadway network and where motor vehicle crashes occur, what you'll find is that the pedestrian crashes, not necessarily fatalities, but crashes, tend to be pretty widely dispersed across the network. So you may not have locations where there are 20 crashes happening. You may have one here, one there, one somewhere else, and it can be really hard to identify a hotspot, and so it's kind of cost ineffective for pedestrians. Also, crash risk factors for pedestrians are different than they are for motor vehicles. It should be pretty obvious, but a pedestrian is not shelled in a 4,000-pound steel cage. What puts them at risk is different than what puts a motor vehicle at risk. And our process for how we identify risks and how we treat safety is often guided by bad data or poor data or missing data. And when it comes to pedestrians, unfortunately, a lot of locations just don't collect a lot of data. We make assumptions about where people are walking, what facilities they want to use, but we don't necessarily have that backed up with origin destination analysis. We don't have counters out there necessarily looking at what our annual average daily pedestrian traffic is. We're kind of missing some of the picture here. So what I would argue we need to do, not necessarily instead of, but in addition to hotspot analysis, is to have a risk-based method. So one way to do a risk-based network screening approach, several of you in the chat mentioned using the Highway Safety Manual. And the Highway Safety Manual lays out a series of what are called safety performance functions, or SPFs. These are essentially just equations that you can use to predict the number of crashes on a facility. A very, very rough SPF here that I provided allows you to predict the number of crashes based on your annual average daily traffic and your segment length. And there are some SPFs in the Highway Safety Manual for pedestrians, but they aren't always the best measures. They're not always calibrated for individual locations. And again, a lot of places are even missing that basic pedestrian exposure variable that you need to make accurate predictions. I think we should use SPFs instead of crash rates. I saw several folks list crash rates in the chat pod. I think crash rates are good if you're trying to get a very quick sense of safety performance. If you're saying, hey, how does this facility compare to a very similar facility with very similar traffic patterns? A crash rate is a good ratio to look at to say A or B, but it misses a lot of the picture and also has some limitations. Some of those being that crash rates can fluctuate significantly with traffic volume. I saw at TRB this year, there were no less than 4 different papers looking at crash patterns in Florida as a result of the pandemic. I think all of us saw that traffic congestion just went way down during the pandemic. And so a crash rate is essentially crash frequency over your traffic volume. And in that case, if your denominator goes way down, it can change the way that your crash rate looks. And it doesn't necessarily reflect realistic traffic safety. And there's an assumed linear relationship there. If you are looking at just a ratio, you assume that, as your traffic volume goes up, maybe your crash rate goes up. As your traffic volume goes down, maybe your crash rate goes down. That isn't necessarily always true. And in fact, we recently did a project for the Federal Highway Administration looking at intersection angle. So where 2 roadways meet, what is the ideal angle for intersection? And found that contrary to a lot of guidance saying, well, 60 degrees is probably good enough, we found that crashes actually peaked between about 55 degrees and 75 degrees. And it's actually a curvilinear shape, so kind of an upside down U or an N. And this is true for a lot of roadway parameters. You have kind of a curvilinear shape. It's true for a lot of traffic volumes. You have a curvilinear shape. You get changes at very high and very low values of roadway and traffic volume data. And so that linear relationship isn't always accurate to assume. Crash rates sometimes can tell us a little about the safety effects of roadway features. So if I wanted to know what effect does having a sidewalk buffer have on pedestrian crashes, a crash rate can't actually answer that question for me. So I need a method that's a little bit more rigorous. And crash rates aren't really comparable between facility types. I mentioned earlier that you could use it as a rough ratio between two very similar facilities to kind of make a quick decision and to get a sense of where you might have some hot spots. But if you're trying to compare, say, a 6-lane arterial to a 2-lane rural highway, your crash rate isn't really going to accomplish that comparison for you. So I would make the argument that if you're trying to address risk, you should probably err on the side of the more rigorous SPF developments for network screening. And the SPF and systemic process then fits into sort of a chain of reactive versus proactive methods. In fact, that third square on the figure on the right is what I would put the systemic process at. So when I'm talking about a systemic approach to safety that addresses risk, what I'm talking about is using safety performance functions or even empirical Bayes measures of safety. And we actually did both for this project, but I'm only really talking about SPFs at the moment. Using those to identify what are our common risk factors that exist throughout the network based on our crash data, and then where do we also see these risk factors even if crashes haven't occurred there. So an example of that might be a lack of sidewalks on a roadway. So maybe you go and you develop an SPF and you find, hey, I actually have a statistically significant relationship for sidewalks to crashes, or sorry, for lack of sidewalks to crashes. Now, my crash data for pedestrians only tells me that these 3 intersections have crashes right now. But I see that there are similar roadway types that also are lacking sidewalks and maybe have similar traffic volumes and pedestrian volumes as these 3 elsewhere in the network. Maybe those also should be addressed because those might also be sites of risk. So you can use this SPF, this risk-based approach to actually be proactive and find all of your locations that might be problems, and then you can actually prevent crashes in the future. So you can move from addressing crashes that have already occurred to preventing crashes that will occur. And I think this gets at the idea of the safety individualism that I hinted at earlier. How it is that crashes actually happen. If I were to survey the group, I'm sure that I would hear that literally everyone on this call has probably heard that all crashes or 94% of crashes are the result of driver error. It's something that I read a lot when I was first going through graduate school, that I even put in some of my papers. I've heard it at pretty much every TRB meeting that I've ever been in. And unfortunately, it's actually a misunderstanding of the report where that statistic came from. So that report, what it actually says is that while 94% of the crashes observed did have human or driver error involved, that driver error was actually the last causal factor in the causal chain. So there were a series of other issues that lined up, and then driver error was produced, and then that resulted in a crash. So it was kind of the last thing that knocked over the dominoes, if you will. And what this is getting at is this idea of latent risk in our environment. So in the way that we have prioritized roadway investment in this country is really around automobile mobility. And whenever we are prioritizing automobiles, we are creating an environment that can be hostile toward pedestrians. It's not always, but pedestrians are much more susceptible to speed, much more susceptible to mass, and they just aren't protected by a steel shell. And so we have these errors where maybe the way that we're designing are building in risks for pedestrians that can, when driver error does occur, can lead to a fatal crash. So as an example of that, an engineering countermeasure, an engineering standard that we might all take as the gospel in our approach for designing roadways is a 12-foot lane width. That tends to be what we look at for level of service, and things that we can quickly address is make all lanes 12 foot. And in fact, that might be good for automobiles. But when it comes to pedestrians, research has found that actually narrower lanes and having closer objects to the roadway, which is counterintuitive for what drivers need, but those objects that are a little bit closer to the roadway actually causes what's called visual friction. And you actually find with increased visual friction that it sends subconscious cues to the driver to naturally slow down. So if we are prioritizing pedestrian safety, we may do designs that don't necessarily fit into our scheme of how we prioritize motor vehicle needs, but they can help address some of these crashes. So this is sort of an idea of moving away from this paradigm that, well, all crashes are caused by driver error, so we just need to install Countermeasures or education is often honestly used more even than engineering countermeasures sometimes, and then that'll prevent crashes. So moving to an understanding that there's a latent error pathway, that we have risks built into our environment that influence the amount of driver error that can happen that ends up resulting in crashes, especially severe and fatal crashes. So what I would argue is that if we want to address that very troubling pedestrian crash trend, we need to try to be proactive, and we need to look at these latent risks, and we need to think about the way that we design our roadways to make sure that we're not just giving pedestrians short change. A couple examples here. This looks like a pretty good 4-lane arterial. It actually has a nice division there with some trees in it. It's got good tree cover. In some ways, this looks like it might be nice and safe, but then you see that for some reason there's a utility pole just right in the middle of the sidewalk. And so when you see a media report that's like, oh, the pedestrian wasn't in the crosswalk for some reason, it might actually be worth going and looking at where the crash occurred to see, well, yeah, they weren't in the crosswalk because maybe there was just a utility pole in the middle of the sidewalk. Maybe there was some other issue that caused that pedestrian to step into the roadway and therefore get hit by a car. You might also consider, well, where have we placed our transit stops and other facilities? Does this actually conform to the way that pedestrians need to use the roadway to access their destinations? And so if, say, you do some OD analysis and you're looking at, well, where are pedestrians coming and going? Well, if they're trying to go from this transit location across the street, which is, I think, a 4-lane arterial with a 2-way left turn lane in the middle there, or I guess, sorry, that's just a left turn lane, over to their home, there's no crosswalk here. And a lot of times our expectation is just that pedestrians are going to walk half a mile, maybe a mile down to the next intersection, cross there, and then walk all the way back. That's kind of unfair and unrealistic of the way that we would expect people to use the roadway, especially given the fact that we've already prioritized a high degree of access and mobility and turning maneuvers to motor vehicles. So good engineering practice might be just to look at, well, if we have transit stops, let's make sure there's a crosswalk at every single transit stop. What I'm trying to get at is we need to, when we are thinking about our roadway, think about the way that we've designed it and built it. Does that meet realistic expectations of environmental risk? Are we creating more risks by the way we design things, or are we mitigating risks? And that is a way that I think the systemic approach differs from traditional traffic safety management. So in this project, we laid out a 7-step process. I'm really only going to be focusing on the first 5, although 6 and 7 are important. But you want to start out by defining your study scope. So for the systemic process that we did in this report, we worked with the city of Seattle and looked at 23,636 roadway segments throughout the city. And we started with a crash tree to identify which crash types might be most treatable with engineering countermeasures. Now, I'll show you this crash tree on the next page, but what we ended up finding is that crashes between vehicles traveling straight and pedestrians crossing the street segments suggest where are locations that are pedestrians crossing the street and where they're getting hit by cars traveling straight. There were 802 crashes of that kind in the data. And then we also looked at crashes between pedestrians and vehicles at night on segments. So we're not looking at intersection crashes in this particular study. That came in a previous study. I won't really address that here, but there are systemic treatments for intersections as well. So we looked at 8 years of crash data from 2007 to 2014, and we tried to capture different parameters, different variables related to roadway design, traffic volumes, our population, and our development types. So this is that crash tree I was talking about. In the city of Seattle, 30% of the crashes with pedestrians were occurring along segments, so not between the intersection influence area, essentially. And then we found that 22% of those were occurring at motor vehicles just going straight. And then the rest were other, so that's why we looked at those nighttime crashes. And then we pulled a bunch of data together for the second step of compiling our data. And we wanted to look beyond just what are the engineering principles. We wanted to really understand what is the context in which people are walking. Why would they be walking along certain segments? And so that's where you pull things like, where are university locations? What is the median income of an area? Where are the attractors and generators of our trips? What is the commercial density that might be attracting pedestrians to be walking along this segment? And where are the transit stops? And so we compiled all of this into a big spreadsheet. This is not exactly how it looks, but kind of representative here, where we assigned each segment a different ID, and then we looked at the number of crashes that occurred per year. So we had, 8 copies per segment per year. And then motor vehicle traffic, pedestrian traffic, and some other context variables. Now you'll note, even just in the snippet that I've showed you here, that there are a lot of segments where pedestrian crashes don't occur. And this again speaks to that highly dispersed nature of pedestrian crashes. So the third step is to develop our risk factors. And so the way that we went about doing this was programming some safety performance functions, building these models. So we had a 2-step approach. I don't really want to spend too much time on this first one. It's called conditional random forest regression. Basically, you take all of the data that you have, all of the individual factors, and you look at, you use some machine learning to essentially look at which of these factors pop up most frequently in relation to crashes within the kind of broader crash tree. And that narrowed it down to about 30 factors that we could then examine. And then I took those 30 factors and I did what's called negative binomial regression. So regression is just the act of fitting crash data to a straight line. Negative binomial regression is a way of doing that and avoiding some of the biases that can come from seasonality and regression to the mean type behavior over the period of looking at this type of analysis. And so we only retain the statistically significant variables in our models. I developed one SPF for both of those 2 crash types and tried to find the model that just provided the best variable fit. And by that I mean, to capture some of that curvilinear relationship that I was talking about, you'll see when I show you the variables that we found were statistically significant, sometimes it includes including a second term for, say, traffic volume. So you might have your ADT as one variable. You might have a log of ADT as your second variable, and that's to kind of capture that curvilinear relationship between crashes and traffic volume. So we did include some different transformations and just try to find what model best fit the shape of the data. So these are the next 2 slides are tables showing our statistically significant variables. This one has some of the exposure. Exposure is kind of a shorthand for traffic volume and context variables. So exposure to risk, that might be a way to think about this. But we had 2 different parameters for traffic volume, and each one was significant in one of the 2 model types. We had bus traffic, and we had pedestrians walking, and we had mean income and commercial density and light pole density. The pluses here mean that as this variable increases, the number of crashes we predict increases. So a lot of these are intuitive. If you look at motor vehicle volume, you might predict that as that goes up, our pedestrian crashes will go up. You might also predict that as your pedestrian volume goes up, your pedestrian crashes will go up. That makes sense, right? Just from an intuitive standpoint. If there are more pedestrians walking along the street, there's more potential for one of those pedestrians to get hit. One of the ones that is a bit counterintuitive here is this light pole density variable, where that's a plus sign, meaning that as our light pole density increased, our predicted crashes increased. I don't think that this means that light poles create an unsafe environment for pedestrians. What I think is occurring is that this is a surrogate measure, meaning for whatever reason, these light poles may have been installed in locations where pedestrians are already walking in higher numbers, or if these light stalls were installed, that may be a location where pedestrians like to walk. And so this sort of captures a location where pedestrians are likely to be and therefore more likely to be hit. Now, the roadway and built environment ones, these are the risk factors that we can try to address with our engineering countermeasures. And NS here just means not significant, but again, we have some pluses and minuses here, and a lot of this is, again, intuitive. Higher speed limits increase that chance of, or increase the number of predicted pedestrian crashes. Multiple lanes, this increases that predicted number. I saw someone earlier in the chat pod mention conflict analysis. And so if you think intuitively, if you have more lanes of traffic that you need to cross, then you increase the number of potential conflicts with pedestrians. Two-way continuous left turn traffic and dedicated right turn lanes, both of those fit that same bill of increasing the number of potential conflicts, especially if it's a slip lane that's uncontrolled, because that means that there's just kind of unfettered ability for drivers to go through there and potentially collide with a pedestrian. Striped parking, this just can lead to situations where drivers don't necessarily see pedestrians. Dedicated right turn lanes, already addressed that one. Marked mid-block crosswalks. Again, I don't think mid-block crosswalks actually increase the risk of a pedestrian. I think it is a place where pedestrians are likely to be found and therefore hit. So one way you might think about that is, well, if we actually have more, maybe this is displacing risk over a larger area. So after we've identified these potential risk factors, then we want to find what are our countermeasures that we can use. So we worked with the city of Seattle to look at locations where crashes are occurring and then identify countermeasures that can be applied across a lot of those locations. So the city of Seattle plotted maps, like heat maps of where these crashes might occur. And I've actually provided a second map here for the empirical Bayes method. Empirical Bayes is also in the Highway Safety Manual. It's kind of the next step above safety performance functions. You weight your safety performance functions with your crash history, and then you look at where you might expect crashes to occur. I'm not focusing on that for this presentation, but it is in the Highway Safety Manual, and it is another method that we gave them in addition to the SPS. But what we see is that aside from those two circles that kind of show a couple differences, for the most part, both maps show high-risk corridors, pretty consistent high-risk corridors. And this leads us to, okay, we know where these crashes are occurring. So if we're focusing on our mid-block locations, which is those segments, how can we treat those? So we can do things like in-roadway yield to pedestrian signs. We can do things like advanced stop yield bars. We can do pedestrian hybrid beacons, high-vis crosswalks, traffic calming like speed humps or speed bumps. We can reduce the number of lanes through our road diet. I was excited to see that your next presentation is going to be about complete streets programs. So road diets are a good way to address some of these safety concerns. Curb extensions and lighting improvements can help improve visibility for pedestrians. So diving into these and how we do it systemically, these next two tables show just the process that we used, where we took this big Excel spreadsheet that we had generated, and we plopped that safety performance function equation I developed, and we really just determined, okay, if we filter the data for some of these different risk factors, what are our top ranking sites? So only looking at one risk factor, such as 4+ through lanes, well, we find that there are 357 sites throughout your network that you could treat with something as easy as a road diet or median island. Now, if you layer on some of these risk factors, so you look at where do we have 4+ lanes, two-way left turn lanes, and parking subsets, well, maybe at these locations, which there's only 25 there, we could treat these with road diets, median islands, and parking restrictions. You'll notice that we have basically just fractions of crashes predicted at each of these sites. That's just due to the nature of the wide dispersal of crashes. A fraction of a crash is essentially, we predict that a crash could occur here. This is a known risk location. And then looking at some of these other things like, well, if we do have a lot of crashes occurring on mid-block crosswalks, then we could do things like high visibility crosswalks. We could do hawk signals, so on and so forth. So once you have your SPF, you could just put it in a spreadsheet and you could just filter to find a series of segments that you can treat. And I think this is an important approach to treat these segments through a safe system project. And why I think this is so important is because, again, as I hinted at, pedestrians are susceptible to kinetic energy. ITE recently published some guidance based on a safe system principle that talks about if we're going to prioritize safety and we're going to really address this trend in pedestrian fatalities, then we have to, in our engineering designs, when we're looking at our built environment, we have to consider things like separating our users in space, separating our users in time, managing our speeds and mass heterogeneity. So do we have really heavy vehicles driving quickly in places where pedestrians would like to be walking? This is why it's important to understand roadway context. And then, can we anticipate human error? So if we know that drivers are going to speed when we give them a bunch of very wide lanes, Anticipating human error might lead us to think, well, let's maybe reduce our lane width. Let's maybe not have so many lanes of traffic going through here. And I think this is really important to consider these principles when we're talking about pedestrians, looking at these systemic treatments, because pedestrians are just super susceptible to kinetic energy. A lot of research has shown that as you increase the speed limit, it results in a higher impact speed, which pretty significantly increases your risk of death. So for someone in a vehicle traveling along at 45 miles per hour, your risk of death probably isn't that high. If you have a posted speed limit of 45 miles per hour, assuming that people are going to drive plus or minus 3 miles per hour, that's about a 50% risk of fatality for pedestrians. It's very different for our most vulnerable road users. And I think if we want an equitable and safe distribution of risk throughout a roadway environment, we need to look at who is most susceptible within that roadway environment. And just some examples of how we can fit these systemic treatments into a safe system. Well, the road diets I've been mentioning, these can help with speed management. And those HAWK beacons, the pedestrian hybrid beacons, they provide separation in time. So they give pedestrians a space to walk where they're less at risk. So as I mentioned earlier, step 6 is step 7 of the process, refine and implement our treatment plan and continue to look at our program impacts. These were outside the scope of this project, but I do think they're very important. Step 6 is where you might use a benefit cost ratio. Now, I would actually make the argument that if you are trying to quantify the benefits of addressing pedestrian safety, you can get really, really good return on investments by looking at locations that have been traditionally underserved. So our high-income areas often have better facilities than our low-income areas, and we might get the best return on investment by removing some of this risk from our low-income areas equitably. And then step 7 is, again, we want to monitor our locations over time just to make sure that we have addressed these risks. This is just a graph showing how you might stretch $10 million for safety improvements, whether you're looking at 500 sites or 13,000 sites. If under a systemic approach, you may not get as many of those hot spots. You may not look at huge crash reduction in individual sites, but you might be able to spread out a lower crash reduction likelihood for lower cost across a huge number of sites within your network. So a lot of states are now adopting the systemic safety approach through a variety of measures. Our report 893, which again I said you could find online if you're interested, it lists several different case studies. I'll cover 2 after this. It also has the stuff from Seattle in there. But if you also want more guidance on this, the Federal Highway Administration has been releasing some webinars through the Focus on Reducing Rural Roadway Departure series, where they talk about systemic improvements. And one of the myths that gets addressed in that webinar series is that it's hard to quantify the benefits of a systemic approach. That's not true. And there is some good guidance through that particular webinar series about how to quantify the benefits of a systemic approach. But 2 examples of how states are using the systemic approach, ODOT, they actually take their Highway Safety Improvement Program funds, their HSIP funds, and they split it into 2 pots. 50% goes to treating those hot spots, those high crash locations I mentioned, and that is really narrowing in on where do we have a lot of fatal crashes. But then the second one is actually entirely towards systemic improvements, one of which is pedestrian and bicycle safety needs. What's interesting to me is that 50% that goes to the systemic improvements, that accounts for 90% of their fatal and injury crashes. So they're getting really good return on their dollar for addressing systemic issues. And the way that they go about doing it is a little bit less data intensive than SPF developments. They actually just assign weights to their different risk factors and then identify the weighted scores per roadway segments and then rank sites based on that. And then Arizona DOT worked with Kimley Horn to do something similar. They also had a less data intensive approach. They assigned weights based on just factors found in research, especially looking at width of your roadways and posted travel speeds, and then they ranked sites for systemic improvements based on that. So in conclusion, I would argue that because pedestrian fatalities in this country are just exploding, it's a super problematic trend. It's because we've built a lot of risks into our environments. And if we want to address those risks, we need to find a way to find those risks systemically because they don't necessarily pop up at hotspots. And so we may want to look at things like context, exposure, where are people walking, to figure out where we can get the best use of our systemic treatments. So with that, I just want to thank Chad and Brian for the invitation to talk today, and I want to thank my co-authors who helped to write a TRB paper based on this report. And with that, thank you. And I will take questions for the last 12 minutes or so.
So before we go into questions, I want to bring up a point that Stephen Ratzke made. There is a webinar put on by FHWA that's linking the safe systems approach with HSIP and SHSPs. If you are interested in further information on this, that will probably be a good webinar to attend.
I think Sarah Abel from ITE was actually one of the lead authors on the report that might be about, if it's what I'm thinking of.
And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the question and answer period box in the in Zoom.
And again, if you wanted to email me and ask for one of these reports, you can always do so. I will put my email in the chat pod again.
And I believe it's also in the slides. Wes, if you'll send me the slides after this, we'll get those posted to our website so everyone has access to that. So we've got a question here from Dr. Liu at Texas Tech. Was pedestrian volume an input, and how did you get it?
Yes, we did have pedestrian volume as an input. There were two models that were used to generate pedestrian estimates for the city of Seattle from a previous project. So I mentioned that our report was built on one that looked at intersection safety. So as part of that intersection report, Tool Design Group predicted some pedestrian volumes using counts and some different machine learning algorithms. They actually had two different estimates of pedestrian volumes, and so we tested both in our models. I don't remember what kind of counters they used to get those numbers that they used in their algorithms, though.
In historical data, was age of pedestrian included?
I don't believe that age was included in our model analysis, at least in the 30 factors or so that we got out of the regression trees. I don't recall that being one of the variables. So it may have been included in the broader one, or maybe median age, but at least as far as the SPFs go, it didn't end up being statistically significant. I have heard of locations where if you have a higher senior population or a group, or say a demographic where there are a lot of children or a lot of older pedestrians, that may change the kind of risks that you have in the environment. If you have, say, leading pedestrian intervals, they may not be properly calibrated to the walking speed of older pedestrians. So age definitely in some situations can be important. I do see a question here about speed limits. Let me scroll up a little bit so I can see all of that. So the question is, I saw speed limit 25 miles per hour versus 30 miles per hour wasn't correlated with higher ped crashes when crossing mid-block, but was correlated with higher crashes at night. Would lowering residential speed limits to 20 or 25 at night, but leaving them at 30 miles per hour, which is common in Texas and faces a lot of political option to be lower, be perhaps good policy? So this is getting at that, something that I have also seen in Texas of like differential speed limits. There is, I think you could use this as a basis to say, yeah, maybe having lower speeds at night would be really good. One problem that I could potentially see with this, and I'm not speaking from a place of like being super familiar with differential speed limits. I know there is research out there on it, but I don't have a lot of personal experience with it. But one potential limitation I could see with having differential speed limits is a sort of driver expectancy. If you have higher speed limits during the day, drivers may expect to be able to travel that same speed at night. So you may just have less compliance with speed limits. Could be one issue I could see with that.
Another question, did Seattle already have a high injury network? Did the research interact with that work?
High injury networks. So trying to remember, I think Seattle did already have a high injury network. High injury networks are something that some states are now doing, looking at, where do they have all of their severe fatal crashes occurring, and they just kind of geolocate these crashes along a roadway system. And yes, high injury networks are a great way to identify where you have risks appearing. And then I see a question in the Q&A that when streets have a high level design, speeding often occurs. So I mentioned the number of lanes repeatedly. And so what do you do with the traffic? So if you're doing things like road diets and or other reductions of the number of lanes on a roadway, where does that traffic go? My opinion is that if we are to achieve safety, we need to think about transferring vehicular traffic to other modes of travel and other modes of transportation. I think congestion is just a huge problem in this country. Safety is a huge problem, and really environmental output is a huge problem. And so I think if we do have really high lanes of traffic, we can consider either finding ways to invest in transit, which is a bigger political question. I recognize as project engineers, we may have little say in transit options, but I think we do need to consider, at least politically, can we transfer trips to transit? Can we invest in other modes to offset some of those trips from vehicular traffic to other modes? The other option would be the one I talked about in regards to the safe system principles of separating users in space. So one is, if you have a really high number of lanes, you have a high level facility, an arterial that you are just having trouble with, you could try something like a pedestrian bridge. Obviously, those don't always get used and they don't always fit into our roadway design, but we could try to find other facilities or even just provide other options. So let's say we want to divert people away from the 6-lane arterial. Well, let's at least try to find another route that they could use without similar losses to their own walking trip distance. That would be a little bit safer. So if we can't achieve those lane reductions, let's try to find ways to separate our users in space. Why do things continue to increase? What was the age of that built environment in Seattle? Has the built environment been there quite a while, and the development adjacent to roadways changing to be more inviting for peds, and the built environment hasn't changed with it? Brian, I think what I'm picking up to your question, this is a very good question, is sometimes we have a mismatch between our roadway functional classification and our land use context. And I do think this is actually a reason why we end up with so many of these environmental risks in the United States, is that we go out and we design an arterial that we think is going to serve pretty sparse traffic, say out on the edge of town. And it is really only designed to carry vehicular traffic because there aren't really a lot of pedestrian attractors around it. And so, it's serving its purpose, but then over time, as zoning changes, as new development comes in, you end up with, say, suddenly a whole bunch of restaurants all along the edge of the 6-lane arterial, and suddenly there's a lot more potential for conflicts. There are pedestrians walking about trying to access these spaces, and our roadway that we first built, that arterial, does not match that sort of pedestrian-friendly built environment that we want to have. And so we end up with this mismatch. And this is a very good question. And it is one thing I might say we want to do to address that. And I don't have all the answers on this. I think this is kind of one of the perennial questions of safe systems. But one way that we might want to try to consider this is when we are designing our initial roadways, either having better zoning uses, better zoning controls, or to at least consider the metrics that we're using to predict our roadway uses in the future. So things like TIA, TIS, how many trips do we expect? What is our level of performance that we expect in the future? Maybe we should try to consider pedestrians and bicyclists more explicitly in those types of TIAs. And I say this knowing that ITE is pretty soon going to be publishing some guidance on incorporating safe systems into TIAs. And so I think there is a conversation happening, especially with TIA, about how we can better match our facilities to our land use. That was a really good question, Brian. I appreciate you asking it. And then Dr. Liu, it looks like he asked one more question about was illumination a contributing factor? This is one that does come up in the literature a lot of, like, what is the conspicuity of pedestrians? Is it hard to see pedestrians? I definitely think illumination is at nights an issue. I don't think it's because all pedestrians wear dark clothing. I think that is a bit of a red herring that we sometimes see in reporting. But this is that issue of, can we provide the right level of roadway lighting to make sure that pedestrians can be seen by drivers? Or can we install things like high-vis crosswalks so that at night drivers get used to seeing these crosswalks and then know to expect pedestrians to be at those? That's part of it could be an issue, is that drivers driving at night, if they suddenly get blinded by a high-vis crosswalk that they're not used to seeing, they might miss pedestrians. But yeah, this illumination question does remain a good research question to explore.
Wes, we want to thank you again for attending and presenting to us today. It was a very interesting presentation. I want to remind everybody that's still on the call that our next meeting will be hosted by Fort Worth, so it will be on Thursday, April 15th. And that will be by Julia Ryan with the City of Fort Worth, talking about complete streets. So look forward to the invite to that Zoom webinar. And if you have any further questions, we will make sure to include Wes's email in the presentation slides that we post on our website, in addition to the PDH and the recording of this presentation. With that, we will adjourn the meeting.